and welcome back to Conceived in Liberty, the Bradley Speaker Series. I'm Rick Graber, president of the Bradley Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us for this series of conversations with former Bradley Prize winners. We've seen major crises impact American life this year. The first, of course, is COVID-19. Another is the crisis of culture, the push to rename buildings, take down monuments, pressure people to think or act in a specific way, has broad implications for the future of our country. With me to discuss this topic is renowned scholar Robbie George. Robbie's the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and is frequently a visiting professor at the Harvard Law School. He's had many significant roles throughout his career, including serving as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics, and as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Robbie's a 2005 winner of the Bradley Prize and a longtime member of the Bradley Foundation's Board of Directors. Hi, and welcome, Robbie.
Thanks so much, Rick. It's really a pleasure to be on with you, and what a joy it's been to serve with you and under your leadership at the Bradley Foundation for these many years. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate your great input. Robbie, let's start with the cancel culture phenomenon. There's been just overwhelming pressure on people in all professions and sectors to resign or apologize for doing or saying something that's deemed offensive by the left. Take, for instance, the editor at a very well-known major newspaper who recently stepped down for publishing an editorial that contained views that were different from the newspaper's staff. What's that do to free speech and the free exchange of ideas that are so fundamental to our country?
It's toxic to those basic values on which our nation is built. It's also toxic to the enterprise of truth-seeking, whether that is in journalism, in the example that you just mentioned, or in the academic world, whether we're talking about universities, where I teach, in that dimension of the academic world, or all the way down into our lower schools, K-12. It's absolutely toxic. In the case you mentioned, which I'll reveal was at the New York Times, the person who was deposed was himself a left liberal, an orthodox left liberal, as anti-conservative as you can imagine, someone who was in the mainstream of the left wing of the movement, and yet he wasn't left enough. One lesson we've learned, Rick, going all the way back to the French Revolution and all the way through the Bolshevik Revolution and on, is that in the end, you can never be radical enough. You can never be left enough. You can never be pure enough. You may be marching somebody to the guillotine today, but you will be marched yourself to the guillotine tomorrow. And I think that's what we are observing. But it's toxic for the country. It's toxic for truth-seeking, and we've got to resist it with all our might. We have to stand against it, refuse to be bullied, refuse to be intimidated, and basically, in the words of that wonderful old hymn, declare that we shall not be moved.
You know, in a sense, the cancel culture is really trying to cancel our history, our national memories, especially with the movement to rename buildings, tear down monuments. Now, some are going to argue that it's disrespectful to honor historical figures whose actions or words would be objectionable in today's world. Others will say, look, we have a history. We've got to learn from the past. What's your take on this issue?
My take is to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, including about American history. We need to affirm in the most ringing possible way the value and goodness of our basic principles, the basic principles of Republican democracy that America pioneered and has stood for. And at our greatest moments, we have been truest to those principles. We should never apologize for them. We should never back away from them. We should never let them go condemned without a rebuke from us, because they are good and true and right principles. At the same time, tell the whole truth, and that is that our nation has never fully lived up to those principles. And many times we have gravely violated them. We have done things we should not be proud of, But we must not whitewash those things. We must tell the whole truth, whether it is offenses against the injustices against the American Indians. It's a very complicated history with the founding period and up through the 19th century. But we need to acknowledge the wrongs done. Certainly the terrible injustice of slavery. That's got to be acknowledged. The failure of Reconstruction has to be acknowledged. The imposition of the dreadful regime, the terrorist regime of Jim Crow against our black fellow citizens, it's got to be acknowledged. But let us not forget, and let us never fail to teach our children, that when we have gone wrong, it's not because of too zealous a commitment to our principles, the principles of the American founding, the principles that make America exceptional. It's been precisely for the opposite reason, an infidelity to those principles, an infidelity to the basic proposition that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So let's not tear down our history. Let's not whitewash our history. Let's not impugn the great men and women who have gone before simply because they had faults. Let he who's without sin cast the first stone there. But whether we're talking about George Washington, or Thomas Jefferson, or Abraham Lincoln, or Frederick Douglass, or Harriet Tubman, or Susan B. Anthony, or all the way up to Martin Luther King and beyond, these were great figures who made great contributions for which they should be honored, despite the fact that they were figures with, in many cases, grave flaws, who had done some bad things. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that, like every human being who has ever walked the earth, Rick, and like any human being who will ever walk the earth, they were people of their times. We must be careful lest we impose on them standards that are ours today, which were very difficult for them to embrace. They were not the standards of the day. Some transcended the standards of the day, as I hope some of us will transcend standards of the day that are not actually truly right and defensible, and they should be credited for that. But there's a fault, I would call it a sin, and it's called presentism. That is judging the past entirely by the standards of the present. Once, Rick, you have embraced presentism, you have placed yourself in a condition of permanent war, because you will be permanently at war with your past. It means you can have no heritage that you affirm. The great deeds of those who've gone before and made possible the blessings you enjoy must then be unacknowledged. We cannot be grateful for them because those figures had flaws. As times change, as history moves on, history grows longer. and behind us are things that in the future we may look back and not think well of. We may look back and regret. Do we want each generation to be permanently at war with its history, to be deprived of any heritage? So I'll conclude, Rick. I've been rambling on too long by saying we can do this. We, the people, we, the exceptional American people, can do this. But it means telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Not whitewashing, but also not apologizing for greatness in our leaders, in the great figures of the past, and in our exceptional nation itself.
Robbie, you've written extensively about the decline of the family and the role of religion in society, especially among millennials. How does the breakdown of civil society contribute to the divisions that seem so strong in our culture and politics today?
Well, Rick, the great visitor from France who taught us Americans so much about our own democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, who came here in the 1830s to study our prison system, actually. But he got interested in the whole of the American system, in American democracy, and wrote the multi-volume, 2-volume work called Democracy in America. He put his finger on one of the things that made America great even then, and made American exceptional even then. going beyond our formal constitutional structures and mechanisms, the institutions of the Constitution, and even beyond the basic principles articulated in the Constitution. Tocqueville noticed that we had a flourishing civil society. Now, what does that mean? Well, civil society are the non-governmental institutions, the often informal but voluntary associations that are formed by men and women on their own initiative. They can be religious, they can be civic, they can be providing mutual support, mutual aid. The most fundamental unit of civil society is the family, based on the marital bond of husband and wife, bringing up their children with grandma and grandpa in the picture, and perhaps great-grandma and great-grandpa, and uncles and aunties and cousins, the family unit. And then what else is civil society? Well, Tocqueville noticed this as a very important feature of Americans as civil society: religion. Religion not with state sponsorship, as in old Europe, throne and altar Europe, but religion freely expressing the faith and the sentiments of the people who bound themselves together to worship and to act and to do the good that the gospel, in the case of the Christian religion, impels them to do. And then beyond that, it's all the institutions that we could point to even today in our communities when we think of things like the Campfire Girls and the 4-H and the Little League and these things. These are not run by the government and shouldn't be run by the government. Their authority is very important in the lives of human beings, but it shouldn't be taken over by the government. They, Rick, above all other institutions, and certainly prior to the government, bear the primary responsibility and carry the burden of bringing to us citizens, us human beings, health, education, and welfare. They are primarily responsible for health, education, and welfare. And even more fundamentally, they bear the responsibility to transmit to each new generation the values and virtues necessary for people to live successful lives, independent and successful lives, and to be good citizens. Citizenship itself in a Republican democracy like ours depends on private initiative, the family, the institutions of civil society, religion, and so forth. The government needs good citizens. The government will fall if we don't have good citizens, if we are not fulfilling our duties as citizens. But the government doesn't form virtuous people who can be good citizens. Government relies on the family to do that, and the church, and the civic association, and the coach. That's how it works. So it's really important, and it's a mistake sometimes that's made on both the left and the right. The collectivists and those who go too extreme in the libertarian direction will picture society as a contest between the government on the one hand and the individual on the other. They're just two players in the game. And then the question is, how much power to the individual, how much power to the government? Obviously, the extreme libertarians want as much power in the hands of the individual as possible, as little in the hands of government. The collectivists think they want a lot more in the hands of the government. Both miss the essential part of the picture, that third player that Tocqueville, all the way back in 1830, put his finger on. Civil society, that's the third player. So we need to protect the autonomy and integrity and functioning of the institutions of civil society, including being very jealous to protect them against government, which will, if it's not watched, usurp the authority and undermine the autonomy and integrity of those institutions, beginning with the family and the church and so forth.
Last question, Robbie. Much has been made of your friendship with Harvard professor Cornel West, because the two of you, and it's probably an understatement, come from different philosophical perspectives. It seems that in today's world, people are letting politics get in the way of friendships and even family relationships. Do you think we can overcome those tensions by being a little more tolerant of people with different views? And how do we go about doing that?
Well, we must do it. Otherwise, this poor, wounded, disunited country is not going to survive. You know, we've come very close to dissolving on more than one occasion. If you think back to the election of 1800, for example, and then obviously the Civil War, those bonds of affection, as Lincoln called them, those crucial relationships between people who disagree, which are of the essence of civic friendship in a Republican democracy, require cultivation. They require care. They don't just happen, and they can easily be lost. And so it's very important that we reach across the lines of ideological or religious or philosophical difference and try to see what we have in common and whether we can collaborate on shared values, and then figure out ways that we can responsibly and fairly adjudicate our differences when somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose, where we have a democratic struggle over an issue. It might be an economic issue, it might be a social issue, it might have something to do with the environment, but there are going to be some issues on which there are going to be winners and losers. One view will prevail and the other won't. And we need terms of fair cooperation and collaboration for the resolution of our differences. I think those set forth through the wisdom of our founders in the Constitution are the right ones, and that's why we need to be zealous in protecting and abiding by those principles, including insisting that the Supreme Court and the judiciary stay in its lane and not do what they have done so often in the name of the Constitution, grab power from other branches of government, especially the legislative branch, substituting their judgments for the judgments of the elected representatives of the people. Cornell and I agree on all that. My dear brother Cornel West and I agree on all that. We share the view, and we try to practice and model it, that it's time for citizens to be a little more gracious and forbearing toward each other, a little more forgiving, a little more understanding, a little more willing to listen and not just preach, a little more willing to let the guy on the other side unsettle you by challenging even your deepest, even your most cherished, even identity-forming opinions. And we see these problems on the right as well as on the left, a kind of dogmatism and unwillingness to listen to the other guy, and immediate tendency to dismiss the other guy as a fool or a fraud, a bigot or a malicious person or whatever. Now, there are fools out there and there are frauds out there and there are malicious people out there and there are bigots, but most of our fellow citizens, whether they're right or left, are not that. So let's be more gracious toward each other. I've learned an enormous amount from Cornell, even though we disagree. And he's kindly said he's learned so much from me in our conversations. And one of the greatest blessings of my entire life, and perhaps the greatest blessing of my academic life, has been teaching with Cornell. Get the two of us in the classroom, and some magic happens. And what a great thing it is for our students to hear people from competing points of view making the best cases we can possibly make for our perspectives, and at the same time, obviously liking and admiring and even loving each other. We can do this, Rick. We can do this as a nation. But if we don't, we're in big trouble.
Yes. Robbie George, thanks so much for your insights, your perspectives, your observations, so valuable to all of us.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll be joined next time by Mitch Daniels, the current president of Purdue University, and of course, the former governor of the state of Indiana. Until then, thanks so much and stay safe.